this works. We on? Good morning, everybody. Who was out last night with the party, having loads of beers and drinks and stuff? Okay, who left after the free drinks stopped? Pretty much nobody takers. We ended up at a karaoke bar singing, had to be mentioned, I'm really sorry, singing Wonderwall, everybody, doing a bit of Oasis in the, about 1 in the morning, I think it was. So back to the stuff. I'm going to be talking quite passionately, hopefully, about JavaScript. I pretty much write JavaScript day in, day out, as well as HTML5 stuff, CSS3. So one of my pain points, as it were, with new developers, upcoming developers, developers who have been coding JavaScript for a couple of years, they don't quite understand JavaScript and they might think it's something completely different. They might think it's just some pretty dollar signs. So this talk I want to go through some misconceptions of the languages, so misconceptions of jQuery, look at what people think, there's some crazy stuff in there, and then look at what people probably get wrong and think that JavaScript's just this really small language that jQuery does the same thing, whereas jQuery might do this much and JavaScript do this much. So hopefully take you through some cool stuff. I'm sorry if you can't read the grey stuff, it's the contrast, I think, rather than me. So for those who are interested, as I said, I'm a developer. I've just been accepted as a Google developer expert, which is about 100 in the world now. That means that I get to go out to San Francisco some stage during the year, Google I/O, and a summit at the end of the year. We're sort of recognized doing some cool stuff in the community, doing some talks and stuff. So hopefully that will lead to some other cool speaking arrangements where see you all there. You can find me on Twitter, GitHub, all by the same handle. My name's pretty unique, so I've got all the URLs. Any questions, if we don't have time or anything, then you can just tweet me. I always respond to tweets. A bit about me, I work as lead front-end engineer at a company called Apps Broker. We're based all the way back in the southwest in Swindon. We're a Google Enterprise company doing lots of cloud platform stuff, very cutting-edge stuff, and some of you will be quite sad to hear that I develop for Chrome only, which means all the legacy stuff I can just leave behind. So we do lots of cool, interesting stuff there. We've gone through Developer Expert Google. I do lots of open source projects, Conditionizer, Fireshell, HTML5 blank, for any WordPress people. You can find my projects on GitHub. Feel free to contribute. Last year I was approached by Intel, do a lot of HTML5 stuff sort of on the side, outside of work. And a lot of people, I think, write about HTML5, here's a demo. So Intel said, wouldn't it be really cool to build something big? So they contacted me to develop a ginormous page, I think it was like 4,000 lines of code, for rollingstone.com, and that was just loads and loads of HTML5 technology, like stuffing it all into one web page. So that went really well. And then here we are today. So today's session, as I said, misconceptions of jQuery and JavaScript. I think splitting them down the middle and looking at the differences and what the perceptions of both of them are is really important. I want to evaluate why we use jQuery. So a lot of people say, oh, I need jQuery for this. I can't use JavaScript. No, it's not for me. I want to sort of hopefully open some doors. This isn't sort of an anti-jQuery. I don't want you to come up with pitchforks at the end and start chasing me out. But I want to kind of open some doors to people and say, if you know jQuery, if you're confident with it, then the new JavaScript stuff is actually really, really easy to use. And it's very, very similar. So hopefully you'll go away with some good insights on that. Why JavaScript skills are important. JavaScript's probably the language at the minute. It's just going crazy. It's stuff like Node.js. It's on the server. And I think it's going to be around for a long, long while. Especially with sort of newer HTML5 APIs are very JavaScript focused. Taking existing knowledge of jQuery, as I said, if you're very, very confident in making an AJAX request, for example, which is considered very, very difficult in JavaScript if you've never attempted it, we'll actually look at some of these sort of side-by-side examples. performance is a big key, and it's one of my main concerns when building applications. We don't want to build slow applications for our big customers because they're not going to come back for extra work. Using plain JavaScript where we can, where it makes sense to, is a massive, massive performance gain. So we'll look at some stats on that, and hopefully you'll go, "Whoa, that's pretty fast." So we'll start off with the misconceptions of jQuery. Nice and light. I'm afraid there's no pretty pictures at the beginning, so you're going to be death by bullet points. So I think this was applicable probably a year, maybe 2 years ago, when JavaScript was sort of still a messy language. It was horrible to use. It helps me write less code. So I think before jQuery did their whole website rebrand, they were sort of jQuery was write less, do more, wasn't it? So I think that was, oh my God, I need to just include jQuery and write 1/10 of the code and my project's done. That's probably not true anymore. So I want to kind of show side by side what you're used to in jQuery and then the JavaScript equivalent. jQuery will always have me covered. If you're a JavaScript developer, then obviously it's a no. But if you're a straight up jQuery developer, I mean, we still include jQuery in our projects just because I might need a specific API that jQuery does very nicely. But to think that it always has you covered, it's probably not a great mindset, because there's even bugs with jQuery. There's not a solution for everything. And what jQuery tends to do is, if the JavaScript solution is this difficult, it will make it this easy. So when you use this little bit, you don't understand the rest of it. I think understanding is very important. jQuery is the only way to develop front-end code. So I think it's kind of become Craig Buckler, who interviewed me for SitePoint. He said it's become the third, well, the crutch that developers lean on for. And if you were to remove that crutch, how many of us would still be able to develop day in, day out? So I think it's important that we can consider what life would be like without jQuery. jQuery is a must for cross-browser code. I think that's dead true a couple of years ago. We recently developed an application. It was over 1,000 lines of raw JavaScript, and that was it. There was no libraries, cross-browser. It worked down to IE8 because we weren't using like really blazing edge stuff in this one. But where Microsoft got a lot of things wrong, I hate to just give them a poke at that. Stuff like AJAX requests are an absolute nightmare. If you Google how to do a JavaScript AJAX request, you'll get a million articles with code this long, whereas jQuery is just like $.ajax, and it makes it so easy. So back in the day, I think this was very, very important that jQuery, it came at the right time, and it did this for us. But now I think we can consider alternative options. jQuery is a must for complex selections. I think when I first started in jQuery, I think everyone, they can select everything. And this can be really good, but it can be really bad. You end up seeing a selector which might be $ here, and then an nth child, and then the next selector, and the next selector. So it can encourage really, really bad code. And I wrote an article not too long ago that said, if you're kind of creating these crazy selectors, then you might be doing something a little bit wrong. JavaScript shouldn't be dependent on a very specific subset. There should be some component thinking behind it that we can then just bind and reuse. So now we've done jQuery, let's have a look at JavaScript. JavaScript, for me, I did a little bit of market research for this talk. Why are people scared of learning JavaScript? It's too difficult. And I think the lack of proper sort of, not documentation, but it's a very difficult language to kind of get into. I think when you get over the hurdle, it's very, very easy to then keep going, but it's that initial step. So hopefully talks like these where we break it down into little bits and will hopefully make some sense. JavaScript isn't cross-browser without writing lots of code. Definitely applicable a couple of years ago. Like I said, AJAX requests, you might have a try-catch, and there were some ugly solutions just to try to do one thing. And a lot of things such as we're all familiar with sort of jQuery.click. That's an event handler, whereas there are now standardized APIs which are exactly the same as that. But back in, I don't know what year it would have been, but Microsoft actually decided to create their own event handler called attach event. So you then end up doing, if event listener is available, we'll use the standard, else we're going to use Microsoft's version. So it ended up being a complete pain, and we used to do all these rewrites, but then people just go, I can't be bothered with the rewrites, let's just include jQuery and let it do it all for us. JavaScript isn't necessary because jQuery exists. Everybody's laughing. That was a good one. So I think that is probably the point on there. I think it's kind of naive to just think that jQuery will be as it is forever and you'll be writing jQuery forever. There's, like I said, there's Node.js, which is now JavaScript on the server. You can't just include the jQuery library and start writing JavaScript on the server. So having an understanding of JavaScript, you can then dive down into the tools when necessary. So what have these misconceptions done? How have they kind of enhanced or killed the perception of JavaScript? I think a fear of JavaScript is safe to say. A lot of people I know have said, I've said to them, why don't you just learn JavaScript? No, I'm not going to do that. It's too difficult, it's too scary, I don't know where to find stuff. And a reliance on jQuery, not the third wheel, the crutch, sorry. I think a reliance on jQuery is probably not sustainable. New developers learning only jQuery. So we're in a place where a lot of young developers are coming in, and if we only know jQuery and only sing and shout about jQuery, then this kind of JavaScript generation is just going to drop off the radar. And we don't want to be working with and employing people who can only do jQuery, because if there's a very, very difficult problem that needs solving, it might be an object-oriented pattern that's broken that needs fixing, and then a jQuery developer goes, oh, what the hell is this prototype stuff? So having that kind of bringing new developers into learning JavaScript first, which I admittedly didn't do, but now I can sort of sit back with hindsight and advise otherwise. I think this one's really important. It's very hard to find JavaScript resources and answers. How many JavaScript questions do you sort of Google quite a lot? Raise your hands every day. So more often than not, Stack Overflow is probably in the top 5. You click on Stack Overflow. Oh, just use jQuery, man. And then you end up trying to rewrite Google search to not find jQuery. So that makes my life difficult as a JavaScript sort of first. And I think that we need more of this stuff. I think one of the main reasons I blog about this is because I want a sort of a standalone resource that isn't just sort of Mozilla MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. It isn't just here's what an API does. It's here's what an API does, and let's use it in a practical sense. Misconceptions have obscured what JavaScript really is. I said at the beginning that if you're primarily a jQuery developer, you're probably thinking of this sort of size of JavaScript, whereas really it's a lot bigger, what it can actually achieve. It's very different, I think. There is a bit of an argument about a website and a web app and how they're very similar. The web technologies are very similar, but the way that I think the HTML and the CSS, anyone can argue against me, but I think are very similar. Whereas when it comes to JavaScript, it's very, very different. If you're building a data-driven application, you're going to be introducing objects and arrays, and you're going to be dealing with JSON and manipulating objects and sending them back to the server. So there's a lot of heavy stuff happening in the middle. So it's not necessarily all JavaScript in the client. It's not sort of all DOM-based and list elements and targeting, updating stuff. And I think it's kind of given JavaScript a bad name in the fact that people hate it. Like they don't want to learn it. They just want shiny jQueries in a box. Just use jQuery. I was told earlier that this should be a a quote, but I've left it as a bullet. This is one of my favorite JavaScript developers, Douglas Crockford. He's kind of known as the godfather of JavaScript. He's a sensational developer. He knows loads of languages. Very, very intelligent guy. He's a bit quirky at times. JavaScript is the only language people feel like they don't need to learn to use. I think that is my favorite quote ever. And he presented a talk in San Francisco last year, and I think he brought up this quote. And he said, people don't sort of jump on a server and start using a PHP framework. Well, they might do. I don't do PHP. This was his opinion, mine. They don't start using a PHP framework if they don't know any PHP, whereas if nobody knows JavaScript, they just dive in with jQuery. It kind of doesn't make sense. So it's kind of, this reinforces the bad name that JavaScript's kind of been given. The power of jQuery, I don't want to beat it down too much or turn you away from it, but I think assessing what it's done for us is a really good exercise. What jQuery has done for us. So it came at the right time. Back in the mess that JavaScript was a couple of years ago, probably before I was born, it was a complete mess. And jQuery, I think it was 05 or 06, correct me if I'm wrong, that jQuery kind of came mainstream. It fixed a load of problems that developers were having. And it's kind of for me, it's a boat that we all jumped on that needed us to take us to a specific place. And now we're at that place, or at least getting to that place, where we can jump off back onto land. Cross-browser consistencies, very great little wrappers that jQuery provides, makes everything very, very simple. It's got an easy and consistent API. JavaScript has probably very little documentation that makes sense. One of the things that jQuery does very, very well is you can Google the on API and it will tell you, and you've got iframes with examples, and it's very, very detailed. And you can then go on Stack Overflow and find 500,000 other examples. So to find a jQuery solution, which might be half the problem, we might look for a JavaScript alternative, but we might be swamped with jQuery answers and go, I just need to get it done, and just paste it in. But without understanding. It's fine to use code that you understand, but to just kind of black box it and go, I'm just going to paste that and let it work. Because if something doesn't work 2 days later, which has happened to me, you then can't debug it. You don't know the code. And to me, that doesn't make sense. Short learning curve. jQuery is very, very simple. You can include it, just start writing JavaScript straight away. I think that's been one of the great things that it's done. And it makes it very, very easy for new developers and even prototyping stuff. Selectors. jQuery has got a huge library included inside it called Sizzle, which is also owned by the jQuery Foundation. This provides all of the very, very complex selectors that jQuery can do. So you might be doing UL, arrow, li, first child. Then you can do not selectors, so jQuery will kind of work it out in JavaScript, which is kind of sad if you think about it. We're putting so much effort into how great CSS is and all these great CSS selectors, and then we just revert to JavaScript because it's easier. Class manipulation. I think everybody is day in, day out, add class, remove class, toggle class, has class. We're all doing that kind of stuff. Made it very, very easy. There's new standards in JavaScript now called a class list, which is a new API. So jQuery doesn't actually have this internally yet, so it'll be interesting to see when it does. But what jQuery will be doing underneath, it will look at the class attribute, and then depending on what the function is, it will use a regular expression, which looks like gobbledygook if you haven't seen those. I haven't got any examples of regular expressions, but it'll basically read the attribute and then remove and add or do whatever you want accordingly. Great event methods. If you've used the on API, one of the things that I found really great about the event methods is that I used to sort of use the click event and then the change event and those kind of things, but they end up quite limiting yourself. If you ignore .click, .change, all those kind of things, and stick with .on, because on you can have on-click, and if you suddenly need to have a change event bound, you can just put a space in the string, and put change. So you got on, click, change, and it binds it all at once. So that allows you to just make simple changes without pasting the same block of code and just changing it to a change event. Makes difficult stuff a breeze. Ajax, as I said, XHR, which is XML HTTP request. Those are a complete mess. They're a lot better now. Animation, which we're kind of moving away from now. So people who used to love animation, jQuery, and across the page, we're trying to do that with CSS, aren't we? So it kind of makes sense to just pretend that that doesn't exist. We can still obviously do animation with JavaScript. So JavaScript has listened and what's in store for the future. So the time is now. We've got cross-browser consistencies. So for anyone following JavaScript's development, they'll know that the official standard is ECMAScript 262. Who hasn't heard of that? Few people. So this is kind of the underlying workings, and then it's implemented via JavaScript and JScript, and I think ActionScript. JScript is actually Microsoft's implementation of JavaScript. There was some thing with copyrights, so JavaScript that runs in IE is actually called JScript. Easy and consistent APIs. So we got to a time now where, like I said, we can come off the jQuery boat and use existing knowledge to easily transition back to JavaScript. So if JavaScript had done it properly in the first place, I mean, the web has changed immensely in the last couple of years, well, in the last decade. So I mean, JavaScript was probably, now it's trying to be what it should have been at day one, but we didn't know it back then, so it's kind of hard. It's a shorter learning curve. It's not as easy as jQuery. The documentation isn't great. But you can find a lot of good resources. There's so many bloggers, JavaScript advocates, especially if you follow people like Paul Irish and people on the Chrome team. They'll always tweeting stuff about JavaScript. There's a few guys in the industry creating loads and loads of GitHub repositories with loads of JavaScript stuff. So selectors. Who's heard of query selector all? So about half. So for the jQuery people in here, you'll be very, very surprised to know that query selector is exactly the same as, well, pretty much exactly the same as all your jQuery selectors. So if you're one of those people who go, oh, selectors are really, really difficult in JavaScript, and you'll probably see people going, document get element by ID, which was like done 10 years ago. We don't need to do that anymore. We can just do document.query selector, and then we can target classes, attributes, exactly the same as what jQuery does. There are some limitations in older browsers. It doesn't work in IE7 or 6. Those are kind of out the window now. IE8 is limited to CSS2 selectors, so don't do any crazy nth child stuff. But we should try and keep away from those. Class manipulation. I said earlier about classlist API. Classlist is very, very cool. It's a brand new feature. It's been out a couple of years, but it's brand new in terms of JavaScript. And this is pretty much, if you line them side by side, it looks exactly the same as jQuery. So even if you don't know JavaScript, but you do know jQuery, you can then just switch. It's simple. Event standards. So Microsoft got attach event very, well, they implemented their own version of event listeners. IE9 then decided to revert to the standard, as Microsoft take about 10 years too. So we have add event listener. If you're lucky enough to develop for IE9 and above, you're fine. You can use add event listener. And this is the kind of stuff that jQuery will be doing underneath. So every time you go on click, it will go if document.addEventListener, then it will bind the click event using event listener, else we're going to use the attach event. So it kind of abstracts all the difficult, niggly stuff. And obviously, this kind of stuff is project specific. If we're like for myself, we're Chrome only. So add event listener is like you don't think about it because it's well ahead. Taking all of the above, JavaScript doesn't have animation built in. We have to create things and set intervals and then do all this kind of stuff, as well as XHR and Ajax stuff. So knowing all of the above, we can then go and build these sort of micro libraries, and that's something I've been focusing on. It's not building a great big library, and quite a lot of people have responded positively to the fact that these micro libraries might replace a giant library. So you may include 2 or 3 or maybe even 10 of these tiny little libraries that are 1 KB each, and you're saving 90 KB overheads, and all the documentation's there, and you might have fallbacks and stuff. So it's very, very flexible, and you're not limiting yourself to just jQuery then. That one's nearly off the edge of the page. Cross-browser inconsistencies won't be around forever. Interestingly enough, there was a comment on the SitePoint interview for this particular talk, and one of the questions that Craig asked me was, do you think the jQuery project will be abandoned? I said probably not, but now that JavaScript APIs are catching up, we might get to a stage where jQuery is just providing pretty wrappers for stuff that's identical underneath, which kind of redundant. So we're not going to need huge libraries to abstract JavaScript problems, I don't think, in the future. So why do I need to learn this stuff? I'll call it a one-time investment. It might be a bit of a headache for some people, which is a lifetime investment. But the thinking behind this is, if you learn jQuery, you know one thing. If you learn JavaScript, you can then use a little bit of jQuery. You can read how to do a JavaScript something in jQuery. You can use MooTools. You can use any other library. So you're not limiting yourself to just one library. If a jQuery developer knows 100% jQuery, and suddenly the company decides we don't like jQuery, we need to use this, they've got to learn a completely new framework. Whereas if you've got a core understanding of JavaScript, you can just use the bits that make sense as and when. JavaScript performance far outweighs jQuery's. I think this is really important, and doing these slides, I actually was quite surprised of how much faster JavaScript is. We don't actively paste bits of snippets in our code every single day, test them, because we'd get shouted at for not doing any work. But for this particular talk, I think it's about 10 different tests, and there's all the screenshots and stuff to come side by side, so we'll have a look at those. I think you'd be quite surprised as well. Reliance on jQuery isn't sustainable. This bullet point was from my own heart. A couple of years ago, I got declined for a job, and it was a right kick in the teeth. And the feedback was, you don't know JavaScript. So guess what I did? I went and learned JavaScript, I went and learned jQuery, I started writing all this stuff, doing loads of cool stuff with JavaScript, publishing open source projects, I do loads of that kind of stuff, and now I'm talking about JavaScript, so it's been good. The reason I say it isn't sustainable is because, unlike sort of JavaScript, which will work, you kind of know when it works backwards. You can say, if we're developing for IE9, then we can use all these features. Whereas with jQuery, you've got so many releases. You've got version 1.10.1 and 2.1.0, and you're like, which one does that support again? And oh no, my plugin's broken in this version. So you can get yourself into a bit of a mess. And the reason I think it's not sustainable is because if you're going for a job in the future, quite interestingly, I usually help people understand JavaScript a bit better, and they tweet me all the time. And this guy called Chris, he recently tweeted me saying, thank you so much for all the JavaScript stuff that you've been helping me with. Because I can now write raw JavaScript, it's helped me land a better job, better pay, and all that kind of stuff. So it does pay off. Total control and understanding over what you write. I think this is very, very important. One of the things that jQuery does is it's very, very readable, which is arguably very, very good. If you're going to loop through, say, a list of elements, jQuery makes it very, very simple with the each method, but you don't really know what's happening underneath. Had you sort of gone, how do I loop through elements, Google, fight your way through the jQuery answers, and then find a JavaScript answer, you'll then go, oh, what are all these I's and pluses and stuff? And I mean, the first time I looked at it, I was shocked. I was like, what the hell is this god-earthly language? jQuery is heavily DOM-focused. JS is on the server. So I think I touched on it earlier. People kind of get this conception that jQuery is this big, whereas JavaScript is this big. And it's very, very DOM-focused. A couple of years ago, I was building websites, and now I build web apps. And the transition that you have to go from jQuery and building sliders and all this kind of stuff and accordions to talking to a server and writing very, very complex stuff is immense. And I was like, oh my God. And that's why I think one of the key things is to look outside of the jQuery box. It's don't just, jQuery isn't JavaScript. It's not all that JavaScript has to offer. JavaScript and HTML5 are the future. If you work with HTML5 APIs, things like local storage, WebRTC, which is, we've all seen it, webcam request and take a selfie or something. That's all driven via JavaScript. It's called HTML5. It comes under that umbrella, but you need JavaScript to power it. There's no jQuery there. I mean, if you don't know JavaScript and you suddenly get thrown on a HTML5 project, you're going to go, oh my God, what is this crazy stuff? So that's my thinking behind that. So what now? Can we use our existing knowledge to transition? I'll step back for this, it's a bit close. So for anyone who's got a laptop, these slides will be available at the end, so you don't panic if you can't type these in. For each of these demos, there's a JS Fiddle link, and then on the next slide, there's a performance where you can also look at the JS Perf, so you can go to them. It'll be really interesting if you do get these slides later, run all the JS Perfs, because it'll be interesting to see how these are only run on Chrome on my machine, so it might be a little bit biased. So if we get sort of some people to all run some tests, then those will say Chrome does this quick, Firefox does this quick, and all the other mobile browsers and stuff. So it would be good to expand on those. But yeah, you can go to the JS Fiddle. There are some comments and stuff in the JS Fiddles if you want to take them away. It's not sort of pseudocode. There's stuff in the fiddles that actually work. So you can, if you don't know what a selector is or how query selectors, the syntax for it, it's all there. So mainly we use classes. We might use attributes. I use data attributes quite a lot. IDs we might rarely use. I think Harry Roberts is a big fan of that. And we can put the exact same stuff in query selector. As long as we're not doing completely abstract and crazy selectors, we can get away with it. And IE9 supports the CSS3 selectors. If you're developing for that, then you can do all your crazy jQuery selectors. So the performance of these is very, very interesting. Query selector, which was actually a lot faster than I anticipated. I think jQuery uses it underneath, but I'm not sure, because it kind of has to do all these detects and safety checks and go, oh, is the person doing this, is they doing that? And kind of sanitize it, and I think that's where the slowness comes in. So it's 82% slower using jQuery just to select one element, which is quite a difference. The difference here with the dollars, every time you create a dollar with a selector, you're creating a new jQuery object. There's something in JavaScript called a prototype, which is an object. It might be from an array or an element. And what the jQuery object's prototype will have the add class, the has class, all of those funky methods. And each time you create one of these, it inherits all those methods. So it's got to create them, which I imagine adds to the slowness. So as you can see, we're doing exactly the same stuff. I've kind of differentiated them between the word JS and jQuery just for ease. And you can go to the JS Perf. You can do some now if you fancy it. Selectors -FOWD. Some of the URLs are a bit crazy because some were taken, so I just made them up a bit. And then you can just hit run. You'll get a browser stats kind of at the bottom, which is very, very cool. And it will give you a printout of what's fastest in your browser. This is great for testing bits of code that you might think are faster if you're hitting performance. Class manipulation. I've been saying about the class list API, but I mean, the difference between those is nothing, is it? It's very, very simple. Whereas if you were going to create an add class function, you'd probably just walked out the room and gone, that is ridiculously ugly. So now this stuff's native, it's easy, we can all use it. So I've added a couple of comments here. jQuery wraps your code in its own object. So there's a couple of things that JavaScript will do differently. So here we've got something called a DOM token list, which is what the class list uses to return all of your classes. So there are a couple of different class list methods. There's contains, which is the has class. So we can do class list.contains, and we can look for FOWD in there. Don't know why I'm doing that. Speed differences. I think that's quite a difference as well. You'll notice I've got the div and the $div. So this doesn't take into account that new jQuery object creation. So that is actually just for adding the class. You can set up a JS perf to actually cache your selectors beforehand. So by the time these tests are run, these are already available, and there's no performance hits in there. And I think that's quite a difference. Native JavaScript is very, very quickly. Chrome, they're developing something called a V8, which is the JavaScript engine, which is blazingly fast. And this kind of stuff might be a little bit slower in other browsers, but it's going to have that ratio of difference. So getting and setting attributes. I find this syntax in jQuery a bit strange. It's kind of ugly. So to set an attribute, we put the attribute name and then its value. And we use exactly the same function to get the attribute, which can probably be a bit misleading if you've got a bug or something. If I kind of do that, they look the same. It's not very easy to read. Whereas if you look at the JavaScript version, set attribute, get attribute, they're very readable. Speed differences, I don't know why, but 84% seems to be jQuery's favorite number. Selectors are cached again, setting the attributes and getting the attributes. So there's two processes that generally happen if you're working with the DOM in JavaScript. There's reading and then there's writing. So the setting will be writing, so we're writing something to the DOM, and then here we're doing a read lookup. So even doing both is 84% slower with jQuery. Add event listener, it looks very, very similar to ON. It makes it very, very easy to create, providing it's IE9 or above. We'll come on to that though. Functions that work flawlessly. One of the things I think is better with, I'm actually missing a comma and the word false here. If any JavaScript people have picked up on that. I'll put that in afterwards. What the false bit does, jQuery doesn't actually, I don't think it actually does this, but it allows for event capturing, which instead of bubbling events up, it can capture them down. Look at the speeds, 90% slower, and that's just to bind a function. That's not even calling the function. So what have we got? I'm not saying that we're going to bind 168,000 functions a second. It's kind of irrelevant at that point, but 1.6 million is a massive increase. And if you've got a huge application like Facebook, I mean, how many functions does that probably have? This kind of stuff matters. So the DOM ready, everybody loves document ready function. You can actually, I do know before anyone shouts at me, you can omit this bit and just put the function inside there, but for readability, it's a bit easier. So JavaScript APIs have kind of gone, oh, we need a DOM ready, how do we know? And there's jQuery, if you look in the source code, there's this huge function that kind of does the DOM ready stuff. In older browsers of IE, there's a ready state, which it just keeps looping through and waits for it to be at a certain, and we just assume that then the DOM is ready and we fire our stuff. So now we've got an actual standardized event, which fires when the DOM is ready. If you put in scripts at the top of the page, everyone's probably put a script at the top of the page and gone, why isn't my code running? Because you haven't wrapped it in a DOM-ready function. You can either get away with that and just put it right at the bottom, which is absolutely fine. But now we kind of, I don't know whether this was inspired directly from jQuery, it might have been, but the people who come up with the standards will probably have inspiration from other frameworks and libraries. If you do follow JavaScript, there's object.observe, which is a brand new, you can watch for changes on an object. And that was inspired via the AngularJS framework. So it just shows that these things that we build have a long-term effect on the actual languages themselves. This was crazy. I wasn't expecting it to be that much slower. I don't know what jQuery does. It probably goes off to Miami and back or something during this time. But 99% slower. I don't know how it does that. The callback function, which you can't see here, is defined above in the test. And I think it just fires a console log, which is supported in this, so it's fine. If you're going to be firing it, I mean, speed does matter when the page is loading. We want that instantly. We don't want to be wrapping it in a document-ready function when we know this thing's 99% faster. So to me, it's kind of good to put these side by side. And a lot of these I'd seen around on Stack Overflow and JS Perf, but when you actually write them yourself, these I didn't copy from anywhere. When you actually write them yourself, you kind of go, Jesus, that is slow. And it's a good consideration. CSS, we all change attributes in line. We should probably get shouted at for not adding a class and styling it that way. I put some comments on here that for those of you who are new to JavaScript and jQuery, this thing with the curly brackets is called an object. This is an object property called background. This is a color, a property called color. And these are the object values. So what we do is we pass those in to the CSS method. And jQuery, as I said, will loop internally. So it will go, for each of these, it's just going to go bang, 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 and put them on the element. Whereas with JavaScript, we've got something called a style object, which is available on all of the elements, and we can just literally just write to it. So I imagine that jQuery probably does some reading as well, but JavaScript does that natively. 68% slower. I think there's quite, it's probably a noticeable difference if you're going to be having a lot of stuff going on with CSS. Ajax requests. I normally use a Google Maps API thing for these demos just because they're nice and quick. That's the ugly state of how you do an Ajax request with not many backfills. This is XML HTTP request, which is a new, it's not new, but it's kind of being used in better ways. That is 87% slower using jQuery to fetch data from the server. Quite interesting. Array looping. The jQuery has something called each, which abstracts all that kind of stuff. JavaScript caught up and has gone for each. Again, it's quicker. This is the kind of stuff I was talking about that you might look at and go, what on earth is that? If you've not used JavaScript before, that is what is underneath of jQuery. And if you can't debug that, and there's some code that's got that, you might get in a bit of trouble. I think we're nearly low on time, so I'm going to try and flick through these. Object looping is quicker. This is probably my favorite quote. There was a bit of stick online for this. You might not need jQuery.com. Loads of people were hammering it, why are you doing this? But this quote, I think, was probably one of the good bits. At the very least, make sure you know what jQuery is doing for you. So even if you're using jQuery code, know that if it was taken away, you could still write it. You know what it's doing. So I've talked about all these JavaScript APIs, but what is the support for them? I think that's it. So if you want to use these APIs, you might be going, I really wanted to use those when I get home. The good news is, XML HTTP request, we can polyfill them. So if you head over to Modernizer, they've got a load of polyfills. There's some elsewhere as well. You can Google class list polyfill, add event listener polyfill. You can create a small function that does all that stuff, which makes it very, very simple. Try a micro library. I touched on those earlier. They're really, really nice. It's something I've been concentrating on writing, is just these powerful little things that do things really well. Use jQuery if it makes sense. So don't just go and reinvent the wheel. If there's a bit of functionality that's hard, just use it and get stuff done. When to use jQuery? IE 6 to 8 probably. For complex things, when it makes sense to, don't rewrite existing functionality. This was one of my quotes. You don't need to be an expert, but JavaScript skills will help you better understand the language as well as any libraries that you decide to choose. Are we all right for a couple of minutes? Or yeah. So what I wanted to quickly show is some jQuery version. This is the stuff that we might write, and this is the stuff that you can do in JavaScript. And if I flick between those, they're pretty much the same. So hopefully you can go home hit the JS fiddles and start writing some JavaScript. Same again, this is an each. For loop in JavaScript. Some notes here as well. HTML5 needs JavaScript, not jQuery. I mentioned at the beginning that HTML5 APIs are very, very reliant. So these are just literally just some examples of HTML5 APIs or standards that actually use JavaScript. Like, there's no jQuery here. .played isn't a jQuery method. You would be pointless to go and do it. This is a mess. This is why JavaScript got a bad name in the first place, and we're just doing all this browser stuff. You see it in CSS as well, so don't blame me. Geolocation, it's not really a HTML5, but it's umbrellaed under that. Canvas, again, JavaScript. History API, we're controlling the back and forward buttons with JavaScript. WebRTC, stuff like getting your webcam audio. You can pass these in as an object, and it will return them to you. The future is rapidly approaching, and it's a lot of JavaScript. That was my thought for the day. Summing up, learn the language, not the library. Of course, if you want to dive into the library, that's not a problem. Use jQuery when it's appropriate, not as an alternative. If jQuery gets abandoned and it's made illegal and you're never allowed to use it again, half of us would probably panic. JavaScript APIs are somewhat easier when compared. If you're doing something in jQuery which you think might be simple, just have a Google and say, how do I do this in JavaScript? Backwards compatibility won't always be needed. If you're one of those going, I need that browser support, I need it, then in 2 years' time, IE8 is going to be dead, and we've got a pretty good browser with IE9, and we're there. Browser quirks may need wrapper fixes, not libraries, like that ugly WebKit and if this Moz. That we would just create a function to wrap that stuff. We wouldn't write that every time we needed to use it. I don't think that a couple of 100,000 lines of jQuery is going to be needed, because it's just going to be small fixes. New APIs aren't perfect. Neither is jQuery. Understand what's happening under the hood of libraries that you use. Don't just take the easy route. Give yourself a little challenge if you've got time. If you need to get stuff out the window, then do it. And thank you very much.